All right, confidence intervals for two sample means. Conditions should look very familiar, so checking for randomness and sample size less than 10% of population. Do you want to make sure that things are nearly normal or your sample size is greater than 30? And our two groups need to be independent. Here's the formulas for mean and standard deviation. Again, we don't fully need it because we're focusing on that confidence interval. So here is our formula. I'm going to change these y's into x's. So I'm taking my two sample means, my x bar 1 and x bar 2, finding the difference, multiplying by my t-score, add or subtract t-score times the standard deviation. So a little bit different here because we have those two standard deviations. Take the standard deviation for my first sample and square it, divide by the first sample size. Variance is always add, so we have an addition sign here. Same thing with the second sample. Okay, hard part with this is that when we're finding this t-score, we're going to need degrees of freedom. We have to remember that we should be using our calculator to find degrees of freedom. Okay, we'll go through an example here. So resting pulse rates for a random sample of 26 smokers had a mean of 80 beats per minute and a standard deviation of 5 beats per minute. Among 32 randomly chosen non-smokers, the mean and standard deviation were 74 and 6 beats per minute. Both sets of data were roughly symmetric, had no outliers. We want to create and interpret a 95% confidence interval for the difference between smokers and non-smokers. So hopefully you're seeing there's very clearly two groups here, smokers versus non-smokers. No proportions are given to me. Instead, this time I am given means and standard deviations for both groups. So we'll start with checking those conditions again. I need to be random. It does say that both of these are random samples. I need both sample sizes to be less than 10% of the population. So 26 smokers and 32 non-smokers, less than 10% of all smokers and non-smokers. Third one, I'm looking for nearly normal. This one's nice because it describes the distribution as roughly symmetric with no outliers. So I'm assuming there that this symmetric and no outliers should mean nearly normal. Okay, and my last condition, I'm making sure the groups are independent. I definitely think they are. Can't be a smoker and a non-smoker at the same time. Okay, I think it helps to list out my variables first. So I would have my first group here. I'm going to call that X bar 1. These are my smokers. Their average was 80. Standard deviation of 5. Sample size 26. X bar 2. So these are my non-smokers. Whoops. They had an average of 74. Standard deviation 6. There were 32 of them. Okay, eventually we're going to find a t-score, so I'm going to use a little model here. I'm finding 95% confidence. So I know I'm going to be using my inverse t with 0.025. What's hard is I don't have those degrees of freedom right there. So this is where that calculator comes in handy. We're going to go to stat tests. I'm looking for a 2 sample t interval. So here it is, 2 sample t interval. You might want to write that down. 2 sam t interval. we can have data or stats. This time they gave me statistics, so I'm going to have to type that in here. Another reason why it's nice to have everything written down. Always know there's no pooling for means. Never ever on this test will we have to pool for means. So it does give me the interval here, which is nice. I'm going to start with just writing down the degrees of freedom. So they gave me 55.9, so I'm going to round that to 56. Okay, I'm going to leave a little bit of a blank spot here so I can write the formula, but then the AP graders are okay if you just copy this little guy right down. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and plug in this inverse t. We just found degrees of freedom was 56. So that gives me a t-score. Looks like 2 on the dot. Now I know I already have my interval here, but the AP graders do like you to write down what formula you're using. So I'm going to take this formula here and just plug in all of my values so they know I can tell what I'm doing. So I'm going to take x bar 1 minus x bar 2 plus or minus this t-score I just found times the square root, my first standard deviation squared over the first sample. Oops. Plus second standard deviation squared over second sample. It should give me this interval. I forgot to write the template up top, so we can go ahead and write that down as well. So I'm blank % confident that the true average blank, this is where you put whatever the first group is between blank and blank. Make sure you're talking about units here. Higher or lower than the true average blank, which would be your second group. Again, I would definitely write down that template. It's going to be very helpful to have these templates memorized. So back to my smoker, non-smoker example. I'm going to start off my interpretation with, I'm 95% confident that the true average pulse rate for smokers is between 3.1063 beats per minute and 8.8937 beats per minute. Both are positive, so I'm going to say higher than the average pulse rate for non-smokers.